Real Estate Pro Talk is a live radio talk show dedicated to educating its listeners on the entire spectrum of real estate matters. Part of the American dream is owning a home or investment property, or perhaps even becoming a real estate agent yourself. Paul Vanas and his team of real estate professionals have over 250 combined years of experience in the industry. In other words, we can make it happen for you. Why go down the road less traveled when we can put you directly on the real estate superhighway? Whether buying or selling in today's complicated real estate market, or if you just need advice about jumping into the real estate business for a career change, you'll need a decisive edge based on experience. Call Paul Vanas at 401-265-6144 for a free, no-obligation consultation. That's Paul Vanas at 401-265-6144.
Good afternoon. My name is Paul Vanas, and welcome to Real Estate Pro Talk. This is a real estate-oriented program which will cover a variety of topics every Friday afternoon from 3 to 4 here on WOON Radio. Some of the topics we'll be talking about during our time together will be how to buy and sell a home, how to choose a real estate agent, how to choose a mortgage broker, creative financing, home inspections, private mortgage financing, and a whole other host of subjects. I've been in the real estate business coming up on 40 years now, of which I own a real estate brokerage company, a real estate school, and a land development company. All of the knowledge that we're going to try to impart on you today is based on the continuing education classes that I teach licensed real estate brokers and agents, along with my personal experience and those of our expert guests. The goal in doing so is that you'll have the information in hand when you need it. You're welcome to call us today at 401-766-1240 and ask any questions on the subjects we'll be discussing. I'm very pleased today to introduce Sharon Barr from Lead Safe Inspections. Welcome, Sharon.
Thank you, Paul. Glad to be here.
You know, it's great because I've always, this is a subject that's been growing and, over the past few years in not only awareness, but in popularity in the real estate business. Lead, as you all know, lead is any house built prior to 1978, more likely than not, has lead in it, or at least lead paint. Right. And I tell those folks, in my business when I'm working with a buyer, just because the house was built after 1978, it still may have some lead in it because you had guys like my grandfather who had that gallon of cyanized paint in the garage, and even though it's a newer house, he wasn't going to let that go, and he'd still bring it to the next house and use it up because he didn't want to buy another gallon of paint.
Maybe to get rid of it.
Right, exactly. So welcome, Sharon, and we're glad to have you here today.
Thank you.
I always ask a question of everyone from a business standpoint. How did you get into the lead inspection business?
Inspections. Well, I started in the real estate industry like yourself, mine back in 1985, and I wanted to take a real estate class to learn how to buy a house. And then I thought, this is kind of interesting. Let me try this business. And I got into the real estate brokerage business also. And I sold houses for quite a few years. But then I started having kids, stay home for a little while. And then while I was home with the kids, near the end there, this lead law was going into effect in the 1990s. So I did a lot of research on it. It sounded like something that was interesting. So I was also a landlord, so it was an issue that I was going to have to deal with anyway. Right. So as I was researching it and met a few people who their kids had been lead poisoned, I thought I might want to get into the business. Wow. So back in 2004, I think it was, I started doing the lead inspections.
I see. Yeah. Now, there's some education associated with that, right? You had to take a variety of educational courses?
Yeah, we had to take a class that was sanctioned by the Department of Health. I see. And you have to take this, it's a 40-hour class, but then you have to do an apprenticeship under someone who's already licensed.
Oh, okay.
So you have to do so many inspections. There's several different kinds of inspections, so you had to do a little bit of each one of those with another inspector who's been in the business.
So they have to, do they mirror you for so long? Almost like just like an electrician apprentice or a plumber's apprentice, you're a lead apprentice?
Yeah, it was more like I was following them, and then they would let us go, and then they would check our work. They would, follow us around and see how we did. I see. So that lasted probably for about 40 major inspections and 15 or 20 other, the lesser intrusive inspections. And so when you're done with all of that and the experiences you run into, you have a good idea of what you're dealing with.
Wow, that's great. Now,
Yeah.
Lead Safe Inspections is your company?
It is, yes.
Is
My
it-
husband and I own it.
Oh, you both. Okay, great. And he's a lead inspector as well? Or?
Yes, he is.
Oh,
Yep.
great. So it's
Yeah.
a family unit?
It is
You
a
can-
family business. We also have a cousin who works for us, who's another lead inspector, and then a longtime friend.
Yeah.
And then my assistant in the office is a cousin, and then
Wow.
we have one other that isn't family.
That's great. No,
But
that's
other
great
than
when you
that-
have a tight-knit unit
Yeah.
like that. You know, we talk about business sometimes on this show, and because I was in the real estate business quite a while, and I've had a big company and I've had a small company, and when you're big, you push big, and when you're small, you push small. And at this point in my life, I'm glad I'm small because I don't have the responsibility of big.
Yeah.
But
And you have more control too. You know what's going on. You
Absolutely.
can trust the people. You don't know what the other 40 people, if you have working for you, you don't know what they're doing.
Absolutely.
Where if you've got 4 or 5, everyone's pretty good at what they do, and you know what's happening.
Absolutely. So your company, the mission of your company, is to what? Provide an awareness to the buying
The lead issue, yeah.
Okay.
There are several different people who have to deal with the lead issue. Landlords being one, people who are purchasing property another, and then I get many calls for people who have children with lead poisoning.
Oh, wow.
And those are the ones that I actually I feel like I can do my best to work for them, because I go in there and they don't know what to do to get their property safe.
Really?
And so I just did one this morning. Their child had a slight elevation, not too bad. But I went in there and I just showed them where the lead was and what they needed to do to fix it. That's what makes me feel good in this job.
I see.
There are a lot of jobs that I just do because landlords have to do them, and so we'll teach the landlords what to do also.
Sure.
But it's the ones who really need the help that make me feel good about my job when I'm done.
So this is primarily a residential real estate problem. It's not so much commercial. It's with mostly with kids or adults or both.
It is all residential. In Rhode Island requires all rental property to be lead certified.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that everyone is done. There's
see.
a lot of landlords that only do it when they have kids or only when they have Section 8. There are many landlords that do it just because it's the right thing to do, too.
Right.
But Rhode Island does not. Rhode Island requires it on every residential rental property.
Really?
And it started actually from EPA. This isn't a Rhode Island law. This is a national law.
I see.
But EPA started back in the 1980s telling all the states across the country that they had to do something with the lead law.
Wow.
And if they wanted their own program, they could. And Rhode Island picked up their own program and followed the rules that EPA set out there. But some communities, like Massachusetts, for instance, they require you to remove lead from like 5 feet down. Rhode Island doesn't. You can keep your lead, you just have to make it safe.
So when you say 5 feet down, you mean 5 feet, like going up a wall? Anything below 5 feet? What? So a child can't?
So they can't
gain
get to it,
exposure?
yeah.
Okay, I
Yeah,
see.
so if it's a door and the door jamb has lead in it, then they have to remove that door and that door jamb. Yeah.
So that can get pretty expensive in Massachusetts because those a lot of the older homes like we are, and we're
Right.
in the middle of Woonsocket, and the majority of the homes were built back in
Right.
the day. All right.
Yeah, and like I said, in Massachusetts, it's anybody who has kids, though. It's only someone who has a child under the age of 6, because they're the biggest category of people who get lead poisoned. Where in Rhode Island, it's all rental property because adults can get lead poisoned too. But Massachusetts requires you to remove it. Rhode Island just says lead safe.
I see.
Yeah.
So the landlords, every landlord before they rent out a unit is supposed to have this certification?
Yes, they are.
Wow. Okay. I bet you there's a lot of landlords that aren't complying. Right?
There's definitely a lot that are not complying.
You know.
We probably have, I think, 230,000 units, rental units in the state, and that number could even be higher. But we probably are only on number 80,000 certificates that have been written.
Really?
So, the enforcement level isn't there, or the landlords are only doing it when they're forced to, which is like Section 8.
Right.
But what they don't realize is that if there is ever a lead poisoning in their house, they have no insurance. The insurance company does not have to cover them.
That's a real good point.
And I think that's the motivation there for a landlord to do it. It's not that expensive. So if a landlord could just take the time to pass that lead inspection, it's not that difficult to do. We'll go over that, I'm sure. But, if they just did that, they'd have the insurance coverage.
Really?
Because all insurance companies must cover you if you have your lead certificates.
Right.
But they don't if you don't have the certificates.
So how do you, it's kind of off the sheet here, but how does a landlord acquire that certification?
Well, that's what we do. We go out, we do an inspection of the property.
Okay.
There is a training that they have to take. There's a 3-hour seminar that all landlords have to take.
Okay.
And that educates them a little bit.
I see.
And then we go over all the details of what it requires to pass a lead inspection with them.
Now, do you provide the training as well, or do you refer them to
Yes, we do.
a training
Yeah.
facility? Okay, so that's a one-stop shop, so they can call you and they can get everything
Right.
done.
Yep.
I'm sure that makes it convenient for the landlords because they're not going to different places, complying with different rules, with
Right.
so on and so forth. So the typical, Sharon, the typical things that you're looking for in a house. So let's say, for example, I called you today and say, hey, Sharon, come on over and take a look at my house. I'm buying a house, and most is, as our listening audience may or may not know, most homes, when you purchase a home in Rhode Island, the sale is always subject to inspections, or at least most of the time they are. And that should be included in your sales contract to make sure you know what you're buying. And one other than a termite and a home inspection and well water and septic and all those other things, assuming they apply, there's a lead inspection.
Right.
So they would call you to set up this inspection, and you would what then? Go out there, and what are you looking for at that point?
Yeah, well, we have this machine that we would bring out in that instance. It looks like a radar gun that the police officers would use. It's that size.
I see.
And it's an X-ray. So we would put it on all of the different painted surfaces in that house, and it actually reads right through all the layers of paint.
Really?
So it doesn't tell me just the top layer, because we know everything's been painted since 1978, but we want to know what's underneath. So this machine actually reads what's underneath and gives us a number.
Wow.
The higher the number, the higher the level of lead in that paint.
I see.
And we do that room by room. So we would check ceiling, wall, baseboard, door trim, window trim, everything. And you would get a report with all of these numbers on it. We also assess whether or not it's a hazard. Now, a hazard would be chipping paint, let's say. If there's a door jamb that has lead on it and it's chipping, that's a hazard,
And it's
because somebody
visible.
can get sick from it.
I see. Because kids, they peel, they peel off the chip, and
Yeah.
every kid puts everything in their mouth.
Well, that's it. Yeah, and
yeah.
that's why children 6 and under are the most group of, is the group of people that everybody wants to be more cognizant of.
Right.
So, like I said, adults can get poisoned too, but children are crawling around on the floor, or they're picking things up, or as they're crawling around, their hands get dirty, they put their hands in their mouth,
Yeah.
and so they can get it that way. You do have to ingest lead to get sick from it.
Okay.
We could be in this room right here with 100% lead, and as long as it's not some type of a hazard, we're not going to get sick from it.
I see.
And we do have to put it in our mouth. So if you've got chipping paint and there's a paint chip and it falls to the ground and a child might pick that up, if they put it in their mouth, that one paint chip is enough to get them sick.
Really? Wow.
And the big problem, though, is more so dust even. Like paint chips, okay, we as adults can see a paint chip on the floor. We might clean it and pick it up. But the dust that might be created, let's say you go in and you start scraping a little bit, you've now created some dust. And it's the dust that actually poisons people, and children especially, more than anything.
Really?
Another thing that we would look for is like an old wood window, the
Yeah.
ones with the ropes on the sides. Those are probably the number one reason children get lead poisoned. And that's because the window going up and down, all of that friction is causing dust.
I see.
Anytime you lift that window up and put your hand in the window well, you can see that dust on your hand.
Yeah, that's that white powder you kind of put
Exactly.
when you rub against. Yeah, I've seen that before.
Yep.
Wow.
And those windows always have lead. And I've had people say, oh, we've stripped them, or it doesn't have lead, but it's not on the inside, but on the outside does. No matter what you do with those windows, they still have lead in them. Even if you've stripped them, they still have lead built into or absorbed by the wood.
So if you're a buyer of real estate, residential real estate that is, and you have children, I don't see why anyone in their right mind wouldn't get a lead inspection, because I know I'd want to. I mean, that would be almost more important to me than the termite and wood
Right.
boring inspection, because your kids come before the structure. But I didn't know it was as serious as that with the lead. With the kids
Yeah.
eating one chip of paint. That's pretty serious. My grandfather, when I was a kid, he used to make, he used to heat up the lead,
Yep.
and he used to make little fishing sinkers. He had the molds,
And he put it in his mouth to
yeah,
squeeze it tight. Yeah.
And he used to make little lead soldiers. They looked like those little green army men that you would
Yep.
buy. He had all the molds, and we used to play with those when I was a kid.
Yeah.
You bite the head off of it and you throw it like a hand grenade at the other kid. And my God, who knows? Maybe I could have been the next Albert Einstein. I don't know. But
And it's interesting to say that, because a lot of people think, well, why is lead all of a sudden a problem now? Why wasn't it when I was growing up? No one ever talked about it. And that's all because there was no regulation. Nobody was ever tested. And I always say to people, think back when you were in school, like when I was in school, there was kids who were slow.
Right.
Nobody knew why.
Right.
But we know now that they could have been lead poisoned, but there was no testing, so nobody knew.
Wow.
And then, like today, the kids who have autism or Asperger's or some of those diagnoses, some of them could have well been lead poisoned also.
Really?
And if you talk to the elementary school nurses, they actually know the kids who were lead poisoned who now have issues and may be in the school with an IEP or something.
Really?
So there's a direct correlation between lead poisoning and the mental health problems that the kids have.
Now, so the ramifications are what mental health, mental disabilities, I would guess you would call
Right.
it, for lack of a better term. I'm not a medical person, but are there any other medical ramifications other than mental health
Well,
issues?
for the most part, it affects the children in their brain. It goes through their nervous system.
Yeah.
So it is going to affect them as far as their development goes. And they could go backwards in their development, or they just might have learning difficulties. There's also other problems with, even as adults. If we got lead poisoned when we were younger, it could have affected our bodies, which may come out later.
Really?
And but there's things like fatigue. Impotence is one, cataracts is another.
Wow, cataracts too, huh?
Yeah. The CDC had done a study one time that cataracts had some correlation to lead poisoning. Damage to the fetus if somebody is pregnant. It can go right to the fetus too. So any pregnant woman should stay away from a construction zone.
Really?
And what do they want to do? The first thing they find out they're pregnant, they want to redo the baby's room.
Right.
Well, they
Right,
should check
right.
first.
I never thought of that.
Yeah.
Wow.
They should check first to see if it's got lead in it before you start, scraping paint or taking a wall down or something.
Boy.
But yeah, it's mostly brain damage, but kidneys in adults. There's another contractor that I worked with who, after he took our class, he went and had his blood tested. And he was an exterior painter down in Newport, so they definitely have a lot of lead paint by the water.
Right.
And his level, now, for sake of a number, children's lead levels can't be higher than a 5, and then it's considered a poisoning. We as adults, the action level for us is a 30.
I see.
And then if you're up above a 50, you're off the job. But his level was a 72.
Wow.
And
Now, when you say a 50 or a 30 or a 72, is that a blood test, or how do they find that out?
Yes, it is a blood test.
Okay.
And it's a very simple $15, $20 blood test.
I see.
And any contractor that's listening should have their blood tested and see how they are.
Really?
They're supposed to do that yearly anyway, but most of them don't. But if they did, they may find that they do have it in their system.
Now, is it one of those things where they prick your finger, like when they check for your
No,
blood
they would-
sugar, or is it an actual, they have to draw it out of you like a syringe type of...
Yeah, they would do a venous check, because
Okay.
if they
A
do it on
venous
the
check,
finger...
Yeah, I didn't know the name of it.
Yeah, if they do it on the finger, you might have lead on your finger, so it could give a false positive.
Good point.
Yeah, so
Wow.
they do actually take blood out of the vein, and they will test it. Now, at a level of 72, his doctor told him it'll probably be his kidneys that'll fail down the road.
Really? Wow.
Yep.
I think of myself, I grew up in a blue collar family, so basically it was all, you didn't call anybody when you needed to do
Yeah.
work. You did it yourself. You learned that from your parents, and they learned it from their parents, and so on and so forth. And, the houses that I flipped over the years. I had scraping the side, with an orbital sander and the dust without wearing a mask because I didn't have time to run to the store to buy the mask. And, it's kind of scary when you think about it.
I did the same thing. A friend of mine bought a house back in the 80s, and we were up on staging with sanders and grinding the paint off the exterior. I didn't know anything about that.
Yep.
And I can't believe, I mean, we probably contaminated the whole neighborhood.
Right. No, exactly.
But we just didn't know because nobody knew anything about it until then.
Yep.
Now, the paint companies did. Other countries banned it a lot sooner than we did.
Really?
But we didn't do anything until the 80s before we started talking about it.
It's funny. I remember reading something years ago that basically that the government at one time, and I don't know how factual this article is, but the government was actually mandating that lead was in paint, in the 1940s and 50s because people were complaining that the paint on the side of their house was peeling. The paint wasn't lasting as long as it should. So some consumer protection group or whatever came forward and, kind of not forced, but had the paint companies put more lead in the paint as a bonding agent. And then, of course, 30 years later, it's just the opposite of what should have happened. So it just goes to show that how
But
things
that's
can
why
change.
they added lead to the paint, because it lasted longer.
Right.
And it was a harder paint. So even where you might find it, like in a door jamb, for instance, you're going in and out of that door, you're banging it all the time. If lead paint is on it, it lasts longer. It doesn't chip as easily.
Wow.
And that's why they put it, especially on the outside.
Right. Yeah, well, like I go back to my grandfather. He used to paint one side of the house every 3 to 4 years. So it would take 12 years or so and the paint job would essentially last 12 years. Where now, when I stained my house a few years ago, I don't think I got 3 years out of it. It looked awful after 3 years because it was just oil, basically.
The paint industry actually has come up with a lot better paints now than when this was first banned too. There are some paints out there that still will last 10 years, which is great. Yeah.
Wow. So, so the people at risk, who are at the most risk of this, are children and pregnant women. Anybody else?
Contractors.
And contractors. Okay.
Yeah,
We always forget the contractors
Yeah.
because we assume that they're taking the correct precautions every day in their business. I remember it was like when the information is off topic, but when the information came out about the pressure treated lumber that had chromium, copper, and arsenic in it.
Yeah.
And these guys are out there on the job site cutting, the wood, and building decks and whatever, and come to find out, the arsenic was in the air and they're breathing it, and of course, and eventually they took the arsenic out of the wood. But this is something very similar.
It is. Yeah, the contractors and they really should take it seriously and do the proper precautions. It doesn't take anything extra. There's, you've got to put plastic down, and if you're in an enclosed environment, you should wear respirators. But a lot of contractors don't want to hear it. They don't want to do it. They think they have to do a lot more, but it really isn't. If they took the class and learned a little bit about it, then they would realize that they don't. It's not that much more that they have to do to be safe.
Just as a
not just for
precaution.
themselves, but for the people that they're working for. Because if they're going inside somebody's house and they're not containing that dust the way they should, they could be exposing the people in that house to it also. But they're breathing it in a lot more than you and I are.
Wow.
And then the kids, they put everything in their mouth, and that's why the children, it's more. They're more susceptible to get it because they put everything in their mouths.
Now, is the paint the biggest problem in the house, lead-wise? I grew up in an old house, and of course we had lead pipes. My dad was a plumber. I used to help him, free labor, 11 years old on a Saturday. And he used to, do what he had to do with these lead pipes and everything. Some woman would call him, and he'd spend 2 hours at our house patching up an old pipe that they really, by today's standards, excuse me, they would just rip it out and put in a new one. But my dad, trying to save the person some money. Now, is exposure to that type of lead a problem, like fishing sinkers and roof flashing and all that other good stuff?
More so, paint is your biggest problem.
Okay.
But some of those things can be a problem. But like water, for instance, the way they've educated us in our classes, the water coming through the pipes in the street, even if the street still has lead pipes, the minerals that are in the water have encapsulated those pipes.
Oh, okay.
So it's kind of the water isn't really touching the lead pipe any longer. Okay. And then once you come into the house, you have copper solder that goes through the pipes too, that's holding them together.
Right, exactly.
Now, if water is sitting in those pipes for some length of time, then they can be exposed to it.
I see.
And you can get it from the water. But for the most part, most of the time, water comes back fine. I have a place right now that I'm trying to get squared away, and we can't find out why the water sample keeps coming up high.
Really?
This one house, we've tried doing several different things. We've changed faucets, we've changed pipes, we've put in, done it in there's two different types of samples. One is a flush and one is a first draw. That means you either take it when it hasn't been used, or you take it after someone has used it for a day. Anyway, we've taken it both ways, and this house keeps coming up lead.
Really?
We've even checked neighbor houses, and they don't have it either. It's just in this one house.
Wow.
And we can't figure out why.
Is it like a municipal water supply, or is it a well?
It is a municipal, and that's why we check the other houses around it, and the other houses don't have it either. So it's just this one house. There's got to be some piping somewhere.
There's something in that
Yeah,
house.
that we just haven't found yet.
Some joint or something in the pipes that has the lead. Wow. So you mentioned something really interesting. So a house that the water has been sitting in the pipe for a while. My parents always told me, let the water run, and they never told you why. That's probably the reason why.
That is the reason, probably, yeah.
Okay.
Because once it gets cold, it's coming up from the ground. It's not coming from your pipes in the house.
Right.
So if it's sitting there for some length, and nobody can really say what length of time is enough for it to get into the water.
Yep.
But if you're going on vacation, let's say, and you come home, the first thing you do, don't go to the sink. Don't get a glass of water to drink. Run your water, flush toilets, run showers before you take a drink out of your faucet.
Yeah, because if you think about it, that water, like you good point you just made, if you go away, that water is sitting in that hot water tank or wherever for, however long you're gone. So that could be an issue.
Yeah.
Wow, this is great information. We're going to take a 1-minute commercial break, and we will be right back with Sharon Barr.
Real Estate Pro Talk is a live radio talk show dedicated to educating its listeners on the entire spectrum of real estate matters. Part of the American dream is owning a home or investment property, or perhaps even becoming a real estate agent yourself. Paul Vanas and his team of real estate professionals have over 250 combined years of experience in the industry. In other words, we can make it happen for you. Why go down the road less traveled when we can put you directly on the real estate superhighway? Whether buying or selling in today's complicated real estate market, or if you just need advice about jumping into the real estate business for a career change, you'll need a decisive edge based on experience. Call Paul Vanas at 401-265-6144 for a free, no-obligation consultation. That's Paul Vanas at 401-265-6144.
Okay, we are back. Welcome back to Real Estate Pro Talk, and we're here today with Sharon Barr from Lead Safe Inspections. Just before we continue our conversation, just a real estate tip of the week. During the winter months, everyone should really check their smoke detectors in the house, especially coming up on the holiday season with Christmas decorations and different decorations in the house. So please check those batteries in your smoke detectors. I know you're supposed to do it. Halloween is usually the anniversary date. If you go on any of the National Fire Protection websites, they say Halloween is the day you should check your batteries every year. But for those of you who have forgotten to check the batteries in those smoke, and especially the carbon monoxide detectors, because that's carbon monoxide is an odorless, colorless gas, which is worse than actual smoke. So check out those detectors, and of course any detector that's over 10 years old should be replaced because of they're just not as efficient as they used to be. Dust and whatnot get into the sensor, into the detectors, and they might not pick up a problem. So having said that, Sharon, we're back. This has been wonderful information for our audience, and I'm sure our listeners are jotting a bunch of stuff down. But tell me about the actual lead inspection process. What's involved in that? So you go in, you bring your gizmo, your radar gun, and what happens from there?
Well, for a buyer, that's what we would do. And we would go room by room and check every different painted surface and give them all. That's a very intensive inspection. So it doesn't damage anything, but it is the best way for us to know if there's any lead.
Right.
I can look at a surface and think, yeah, that's going to be lead based on the type of wood that it is. It's an old piece of wood.
Right.
But until I put that machine on it, even I can't tell you for sure if it's lead.
I see.
So you can't walk into a house and think, okay, it's going to be fine. There's not going to be anything. It looks like it's new.
Yeah.
The only way you know is by putting that machine on it.
Now, how deep? Yeah, this thing, like I guess it's almost like penetrating radar, right?
It is.
How deep when it goes in? Like, in other words, how can I ask this question?
How many layers?
Yeah. How far down do you have to go where it is a problem and it isn't a problem?
Right. Well, all of it doesn't have to be a problem.
Okay.
Just because we find lead, as long as it's not some type of a hazard, which is chipping paint, for instance, then it's still considered safe.
Okay.
So even if we went 20 layers down, if it's got lead, that's okay, if it's not chipping.
Right.
But this machine goes back about 1/4 of an inch. So
Wow.
it will tell us if anything has it right down to the wood.
That's pretty deep.
It is.
Yeah.
The only thing I can't reach is if you have vinyl siding on the outside of the house. I can't get through that and the weatherization board and then the shingle. That's too far deep. But in that case, it's all covered, so who cares?
Wow.
Your vinyl siding's up.
Really?
But for a buyer, that's the best way for them to know what they're dealing with. And if they plan on doing any renovation work once they're in, this gives them the information they need to be able to know whether to handle it safely.
I see.
Now, that's somebody who's purchasing. The next person that might want an inspection is a landlord.
Okay.
Landlords, like I mentioned earlier, they are all supposed to have lead inspections done, but at least you should be doing it to make sure that the kids that are living there are safe. Again, adults don't get poisoned as well as children, or as easily as children do. But if you have any kids in the house, you should definitely make sure that the property is lead safe for that child. And the tenants don't know. They don't know what they're looking for. Many landlords don't even know what they're looking for.
Right.
But the hazards that you have to deal with is chipping paint for the most part.
Yeah.
So the inside the unit, the common hallway, and the exterior. You don't want to have any chipping paint, no cracking, no holes, no peeling paint anywhere.
I see.
Exterior paint has more lead than interior paint does even. Now, if you're dealing with a 3-family here up in Woonsocket or wherever in any of the cities, the oldest houses, it doesn't matter inside or out. They're going to be high levels of lead.
Okay.
If they were painted prior to 1978. Some houses were stained and still may be, or were painted after the stain and after 1978. But anything prior to 78 that does have chipping paint, you want to make sure that you touch all that up.
I see.
But that's the first thing. The second thing, which people don't think about, is the friction surfaces.
Right.
And that would be your old windows, which we touched on earlier.
Double hung windows.
Right.
Okay.
Yep, those are the number one reason kids get poisoned is those windows, and that's coming from the Department of Health. Those windows, because they go up and down, they create dust, and the dust is what poisons the children.
Wow.
And then if you think about it, if a child hears noise outside, where do they go? They go run into the window.
Right.
And then they put their hands on the windowsill and take it in. But then also a couple other friction surfaces are like your doors that are rubbing. You open and close a door. If it's sticking, you have to pull hard on it.
Oh, yeah, sure.
That's going to create dust.
The house settles over the years, or expansion and contraction between winter and summer.
Yep. Sometimes it's just the hinges are loose, and you have to tighten up the hinges a little bit.
Right.
But as that door is rubbing, it's creating that dust too. It's wearing down the paint, and eventually it gets down to the bottom layer.
Yeah.
And then another spot would be your common hallways. In these multifamily houses, they all have lead in the common hallways. Again, because the paint was harder, it lasted longer. So in the common hallways, you got to have stair treads put on your stairs, because where your feet go, you wear off the paint.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, nobody thinks about that.
That's right. Yeah, that's huge.
And then the other thing that we look for is soil. The soil on the exterior of the houses on an old building is always going to be contaminated. Now, if kids are out there playing in there, making mud pies or running their trucks through the mud or through the dirt, they can be ingesting it. Same thing with a dog. You can have your dog sitting in that mud or walking through it and then bringing that into the house, and they can get, bring it into the house that way.
Right.
But soil, as long as it's covered, it doesn't matter because nobody can get to it.
I see.
So if you've got grass growing on it, mulch, gravel, anything, as long as it's covered, it's considered safe.
And that's a good point, because Years ago, didn't they used to use like a lead arsenic pesticide on the fruit trees and things? That that had to go somewhere, right? That had to go into the ground in the yard. We had, I know, growing up, we had pear trees and fruit trees, and who knows what my grandfather used to spray on those trees to keep the bugs off. But I mean, of course, you always washed the fruit after the fact, but. I don't think too many people think of the soil as a contaminated
and it's really
area.
more around the foundation, though, because if you think, how many years does your house peel before you actually go out and paint it?
Right.
It might peel for a couple of years. So now as the snow or the water washes those chips into the ground, it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't ever dissipate. Wow. So it's still there. And if that soil is uncovered, a kid can go play in it, and then they can get it in their hands.
Wow. So it sounds like the paint is the most common issue out of anything, that.
Yeah, all these other things, you can even find it in toys and ceramics and jewelry. There's lead in a lot of other things too.
Yeah.
But the number one reason children get poisoned is paint.
Right.
And it's the dust created from those paints.
They talk about what those cheap plastic toys they sell. I don't want to mention the stores' names because I don't want to get sued. But my wife loves to go to some of these bargain stores and. These plastic things that they come home with that are maybe made overseas. They probably have some sort of lead. When you get a spatula for 50 cents, brand new, I don't know if I'd want to use that spatula to flip over my eggs because I don't know what's in that plastic.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, anything that's regulated by the United States, made in the United States, or like the major toy companies, all of their products have to be tested, even if they make some of them in China or in wherever.
I see.
But if it's regulated, if it's a company regulated by the United States, it cannot have any lead in it.
Wow.
But you're right, when you stop buying them from these stores that take their stuff in from everywhere, and the plastic is not such a big deal because you do have to ingest it. So how are you going to actually ingest that plastic? If you bite a piece off, yes, of course. Wow. But it might also cut up your stomach before you get lead poisoned.
Yeah.
But it's, let's say you buy a train that has paint on it. That could potentially have it.
Sure.
You can buy even tile. Tile has lead in it possibly too. If it has some color. Usually the darker the color, the more chance it has lead in it.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Because it made the color deeper. So the old bathrooms that are retro, like white at the bottom and they have a black rim at the top, that black rim is always very high for lead. So tile can have it too. But all of these other areas that we could find it aren't really... Or they may account for 1% of all of the poisonings if you add all that other stuff together.
I see. So you go in now, you've gone in, you've either a buyer or a landlord has called you to go in. You've identified that there may be an issue with lead paint. How do they remedy it? How do they move forward short of ripping the whole house apart and gutting the house? How do they move forward?
And there are some people who think that's what they have to do, but you shouldn't do that. The more you disturb it, the more chance you're going to make more of an issue.
It makes it worse.
Right.
Okay.
So you're better off leaving what's there. I mean, you could certainly take it off. And I have one landlord who has me come in as soon as he buys a house. He, takes all of the lead out and he makes it lead free. Okay. And that's great, but that's expensive.
Right.
You don't have to go that route. You just have to be diligent about it. And I tell people you have to respect the paint. If it's chipping, you're going to touch it up. So you go through the place and it's all in good condition today, that's fine. Just leave it like that.
I see.
But if there is anything chipping, the whole remedy is about painting it and making it intact, but you have to also do that safely.
Okay.
And that's where the contractors come into play. Now, contractors could be exposing themselves as well as the people living in the house to lead paint and lead paint poisonings.
I see.
And I actually have had several landlords who have been sued by the tenants because they have actually done their own work, and the child that in the house at the time has gotten lead poisoned.
Really? How do they find out if the child did they test for this at school, or they bring the kid to the doctor? How does that work?
It's the doctor's office. Every year your child's supposed to go in for their physical, and every year they'll have a blood test taken for lead. So it's from age 1 up until age 6.
So this goes on. I mean,
continuously.
I should know this. I'm a parent, but unfortunately my wife probably knows this.
She'd take care.
So he was my son was probably tested every year for lead
Yes.
poisoning. Wow.
When he goes for his regular blood test,
Okay.
it's just another one that's added to that.
All right.
Now, all of those numbers go to the Department of Health.
Okay.
And then if the numbers are above certain limits, then the Department of Health will get in touch with the homeowner or the
okay.
doctor's office too. The doctor's office will get in touch. But if it's a high enough number, the Department of Health will actually call the person who's living there and make an appointment to go in and do an inspection for them.
I see.
That's if there's a kid with a high enough blood level test. If they're low enough levels, then the Department of Health doesn't go in, but that's when I would get called,
I see. So that could be really expensive if it's a rental property and all of a sudden the Department of Health shows up at the door and a child has tested positive for lead poisoning. And if that landlord didn't do what they were supposed to do by making that was it lead safe?
Right, let's say, yeah.
Getting a lead safe certificate, there can be some ramifications, right?
Yeah, there is. There can be.
Wow.
Now, I never hear the end of it, but I've had several landlords call me all upset now because they've gotten a lawyer's letter from the tenant. And that's when they call me in. And at this point, it's too late to say, okay, well, you should have done something different. But at this point, at least, from this point forward, make sure your property is lead safe.
I see.
But I never hear how those lawsuits, whether they get settled or...
You're out of it at that point.
Yeah. There's only one that was in the Providence Journal a few years ago, and it took about 19 years from the time that the girl got lead poisoned until the end, and that one had a $350,000...
19 years.
Yeah, because
Really?
you know what it happens is the statute of limitations is actually up 3 years after the kid turns 18.
I see.
So that lawsuit could go on forever. But in this case, I don't know other than what was in the article, but it sounded like they did file the suit a long time ago, but with all the appeals and everything else, it took 19 years before it actually got finalized.
Wow.
But it cost the landlord $350,000, so that was pretty expensive.
Now, I wonder, just off the top, because I'm all, in real estate, there's always liability. And with anything, there's liability in business and so forth. And owning a property is owning a business. I'm wondering if like a child was lead poisoned at someone else's house, and then all of a sudden they show up at my property, and then, of course, they get the blood test, and then the Department of Health is banging on my door. I don't know if that happens, but I'm sure that it could happen, right?
It does actually, yes. It happens often. But the thing is, because of HIPAA regulations, we as landlords cannot ask a tenant to have their kid tested before they come in.
I see.
They just can't do that. It's a medical issue, and we don't have any right to that information. We can't even ask them what their last one was. We just
Really?
don't. As a homeowner, we just can't ask that question of tenants. The only thing is, if somebody was lead poisoned previously, and now they're coming into your house, and now they're claiming lead poisoning, if there was ever a lawsuit involved in that, through discovery, they would get the blood tests that were previous to them living there.
I see.
So at least that would give the landlord something to say, hey, it wasn't my house.
Wow.
But I get called in a lot on those types of, the landlords getting those letters from the tenant. Not so much lawsuits, but it's more that, the tenant has told the landlord.
Really?
And then I'll get called in and I'll go in and educate the tenant as well as the landlord on what needs to be done.
Really?
Like the one I did this morning, there really wasn't too many issues in the apartment. So I really couldn't give them a definitive answer as to where it was coming from. But then there was another one that I did out in Newport one time, and this little girl, she used to lick everything, and children are very oral kids. That's how they learn. And but this girl was more so than normal, and she would lick everything. They had old wood windows in their house, and they had chipping paint on the outside. But other than that, the inside of the house was beautiful. But if this kid is licking a windowsill because she's looking out the window, that's
Right.
where she was probably getting it from.
Wow. Yeah.
And then I had another one that here in Woonsocket that the tenant called me in, and the landlord hadn't had any certificates, and there was chipping paint on all of the door jambs. But this kid was a kid who just literally bit into the wood.
Okay.
Now, everybody thinks kids are chewing on windowsills.
Right.
Now, I've been in this business for about 15 years, and my husband has seen it once, and I've seen it once. I think that's it.
Right.
But other than that, this was the one instance that I did see it. This little girl would bite. She would bite everything. She bit her crib even,
Right.
and the parents they seemed like decent parents. They were trying to do everything they could to stop this kid, but they just couldn't. So in that case, I just had to advise them, and I never advise tenants to leave an apartment because the landlord can make it lead safe. But in this case, these people had to find a house that didn't have any lead.
Really?
Because this kid's level was high already.
Yeah.
And because the windowsill did have lead.
Yeah.
And
it's a behavioral issue at that point.
Right. So in their case, they had to find another apartment that didn't have any lead in it, something newer that had been renovated.
Wow. This is, it's a very deep subject, and the examples that you're bringing up, most people wouldn't think of. You just like even sitting down here today, I wouldn't have never thought of the stair treads going into an apartment having lead in it. And of course, it does. It makes sense. Any surface that has friction associated with it. So, what are the types of fees associated? Are there different fee schedules depending on the different levels of inspections? Or
yeah, depending on which kind we do. Now with landlords, most of that's just all a visual inspection. We don't usually use the machine with the landlords. Once we do the machine, it costs a lot more money because it's more timely. But years ago, all we did have was this machine, and all we had was the Department of Health regulations. With that one can be a little expensive for somebody who's purchasing a house. Not too bad though. I mean, it's only maybe $225, $225 for an average size 1,500 square foot house. The more square footage, the more time it takes, the more we're going to be there, and the price will go up from there. But the landlord one, they finally said, you know what, let's get the landlords involved. We want them to be more proactive. We want them to do more inspections. So let's get them involved. And they brought in the visual inspection. That way, as long as everything's intact, no friction surfaces, it passes. Then we also have to take some dust wipe, which I'd like to go over in a little bit, but we would take dust wipes, and as long as there's no lead in the dust, then they are given a certificate. That one usually costs about $125.
Okay.
So it's not outrageous by any means.
It's a cheap insurance policy, really.
Right. Now, the certificates do expire. They're only good for 2 years.
Okay.
And then unless you get something that's lead-free, and that would be using the machine and not finding any lead anywhere.
I see.
But if we do the visual one, or we find lead, but it's lead-safe right now, those certificates do expire after 2 years because your paint is going to deteriorate.
I see.
If you think about it, 2, 3, 4 years down the road, you need to stop painting again.
So you mean that protective coating that you put over the lead to stop the lead issue, or at least prevent the lead issue, starts to wear out?
It chips.
Okay.
You bang something and it chips.
I see. Yeah, it makes sense. It makes perfect sense. So really, I know most home inspections now for on a regular home inspection in real estate are anywhere between $400 and $600. This is really minimal. I think a radon inspection now is like $100. So this is really a minimal inspection, especially if you have children. I don't understand anyone who reads that seller's the lead disclosure. The language on that lead disclosure is pretty scary.
Yeah.
No one reads anything anymore, unfortunately. They kind of whiz through everything and they sign. But I have my buyers read that thing thoroughly to the point where they really understand what they're not having as an inspection.
Right.
And then 9 out of 10 of them say, if they have kids, they want the inspection.
Right.
It just makes plain sense.
Yeah, there's a brochure that you give out as agents.
Right.
And that's
EPA,
required.
That EPA.
How to protect your family from lead.
How to protect your family, correct.
Yeah, and that's given out for yourself and landlords. Now, this is something landlords might not know, but that brochure is supposed to be given out to every single tenant, and the landlord is supposed to have them sign for that, along with their lead inspections. But even if they do nothing with the lead inspections, they have to give out that brochure. Now, the EPA has a fine of $11,000 for just not giving out that brochure.
Wow.
And if there's a lead poisoning, it triples.
Really?
So, for that one bit, if that's the only thing a landlord today learns, they've saved themselves some money if they get caught not doing it.
Well, excellent pearl of wisdom. All right, well, so we have about 9 minutes left, so we're going to take one more commercial break, and we will be right back.
Real Estate Pro Talk is a live radio talk show dedicated to educating its listeners on the entire spectrum of real estate matters. Part of the American dream is owning a home or investment property, or perhaps even becoming a real estate agent yourself. Paul Vanas and his team of real estate professionals have over 250 combined years of experience in the industry. In other words, we can make it happen for you. Why go down the road less traveled when we can put you directly on the real estate superhighway? Whether buying or selling in today's complicated real estate market, or if you just need advice about jumping into the real estate business for a career change, you'll need a decisive edge based on experience. Call Paul Vanas at 401-265-6144 for a free, no-obligation consultation. That's Paul Vanas at 401-265-6144.
And welcome back to Real Estate Pro Talk. This is Paul Vanas, and we're here today with Sharon Barr from Lead Safe Inspections. Sharon, we're going to get some rain today, I guess. We're not on topic
what
here,
else
but
is new?
We're going to get 2 inches of rain tonight. I was listening to the WOON forecast, and they said we're going to get 2 inches of rain tonight and possibly 2 inches of rain tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I seem to remember, harking back to 1978, if it was ever below 32 degrees, that means we'd probably get about 3 feet of snow tonight.
Yeah.
So thank God that it's rain.
Yeah.
That's all I can say.
That's what I said. The last storm we had last weekend, it was the same thing. It's like this would have been feet of snow.
Imagine a couple of weeks before Christmas to get 3 feet of snow.
Stay away.
Oh, everything will come to a grinding halt. Anyway, let's get back to our subject. So, the contractors. You had mentioned something about during a break about contractors scraping.
Yeah. Now, the one thing I want to mention to contractors is, especially if you're doing, anywhere, inside and out, but I've had many contractors who just go outside and start scraping, and landlords too. Landlord might be painting their own house. But when you start scraping that exterior paint, it is going to get into the house. So what you have to do is, you're always doing it in the summertime because that's when you paint. Right. So you want to make sure you keep your windows closed. Mm-hmm. Make sure you turn off air conditioners or cover the or both. I shouldn't say that. You have to have it off, but also cover the air conditioners.
Because that AC is sucking in
You're
air,
taking
right?
in whatever's outside, bringing it in the house. Exactly. Yep. And that's where I've had 2 landlords. Both of them had poisonings inside the house. Mm-hmm. One of them, I went and took a dust wipe inside of the window area where they had their air conditioner. Now, this is the dust wipes, for sake of a number. Floors can't be higher than 40. Windowsills can't be higher than 250. When I took this sample inside the windowsill, it was 17,000 plus.
Oh, my God.
Exactly. So that's bringing in that paint from the outside into the house. And there was 2 kids in that unit that were lead poisoned as a result of not just that, but there was other issues in the house too. But I also had another contractor who called me, and he went and scraped the exterior of this house and did it all, and called me up and everything's ready. Come down and do an inspection, which it all looked beautiful. Mm-hmm. Even the inside looked beautiful. But when I took a dust sample on the windowsill, actually, I think it might have even been a floor in that instance, but it came back at over 8,000.
Wow.
And so, but that's all because of the exterior. Now, first of all, the windows should stay closed. Mm-hmm. But secondly, before those windows get opened, I always ask contractors when I run into them is lift up the screen from the outside and clean that window well that's exposed to the outside. Right. Because it's not even a requirement in the regulations, but for me, that's where it's going to land. Right. It's going to go through the screen.
It's trapped. The screen, the bottom of the screen traps everything on the
between there and the sill on the inside. Right, that area is going to have all that exterior. So lift up the screens, clean that area out before you let the people on the inside open up the windows.
Wow, that's interesting. Mm. So the wipe test that you mentioned, mm-hmm. How does that work?
Well, these wipes have to be done on everything that has to have a certificate. So if a landlord's looking for a certificate or a contractor's looking for one, and a contractor might want that, let's say they did over the kitchen, but they didn't do the rest of the house. They might want us to just come in and take dust wipes of the area that they have contained.
I see.
But a landlord, it's the whole apartment. So we want to look through the whole place and take our dust wipes.
I see.
Now, those dust wipes have to be sent to a lab, and the lab analyzes it. And then when those dust wipes come back, that's what allows us to write the certificate.
Okay.
But you can't, like if you think of the number 40 on a 12 by 12 square on your floor, if you took a penny and you divide that into 2 million pieces, you can't have more than 40 of those 2 millionth pieces on the floor.
Wow.
So you can't even see that.
Wow.
And then the key to cleaning to get rid of that.
The laboratory, not to interrupt, but the laboratory comes back and they give you this number, and there's a sliding scale that you use?
Well, the Department of Health gives us the regulations. In the regulations, there's limits.
Okay.
And that's where the limits, the 40 on the floor, 250 on a windowsill, 400 on a window well. That's micrograms per square foot.
Right.
And so what we're doing is try to take a 12 by 12 square And then if for some reason we do a windowsill, we give them the dimensions because you're going to have a certain amount of lead per square inch.
I see.
And so these numbers come from the Department of Health, which also come from EPA originally.
Really?
Now, the key to cleaning, you got to make sure that you clean really well before you call us in, especially if it's a landlord looking for that certificate. If you've done any work in the property, the lead is going to fly around. And you could be cleaning, you could be doing something in the living room and the kitchen floor is going to fail. And that's because you brought that from one room to the next.
I see.
Change your water often. Use paper towels as much as you can so you can throw them away, not put them back in the water, so you're not moving the water from one or the dust from one room to the next,
I see.
or one side of the room to the other.
Makes perfect sense. So where do you think the issue is going with regards to governmental regulations? Do you think they're going to tighten regulations, or?
I think we're where we're going to be.
Okay.
Nothing has seemed to really change drastically in quite a few years now. So I think we're here. I think this is going to stick around. It's not going anywhere.
I see.
Now, the one thing that may come up is contractors may be responsible for even commercial property. They haven't done that yet, but EPA is talking about it now.
Really?
Now, contractors also have to have a contract or have to be registered with the Contractors Registration Board. And one of the requirements there now, and this is the last few years, they require you to have at least 5 hours of continuing ed credits. Well, one of those credits could be the lead paint class.
I see.
If they don't have a license whatsoever, then they need an 8-hour class.
The class you teach?
Yes, we teach that class.
Okay, good.
We teach it twice a month, and it educates the contractors on what their responsibility is. And there's even paperwork that they're supposed to follow there. If they don't do it, there are fines associated too. That can be hefty. EPA can fine up to $37,500 per day per instance.
Wow.
That's if you're not licensed. So somebody who's out there doing the work should be licensed if they're touching any lead paint.
I see.
And but they could get 8 hours of continuing ed credit right there, and that one class will be all they need to get their
Perfect.
registration.
Yeah, and that meets the requirements of
Right.
the Rhode Island Contractors Registration Board. Wow. So we have about a minute and a half left. Sharon, while we're here, why don't you give the audience your contact information?
Sure.
Phone number, email, website, whatever you have to do.
Sure. My company name is Lead Safe Inspections and Consulting, Inc. And all the people that we've spoken about today, the buyers, the landlords, the contractors, those are the groups of people that, we work for. We'd be glad to work with any landlords. When you call our office, we're going to go over every single thing that you need to do before we even come out to your property. So hopefully you're going to pass right away. My contact information is, the phone number is 401-475-5858. And our email address is theleadpaintguy@gmail.com. And everybody says, why not gal or girl? Well, we have guys working for us too, and that wouldn't go over too well.
Wow.
So it's theleadpaintguy@gmail.com. And then we also have a website, and on our website, all of the regulations are there, and that's leadsaferi.com. So any regulations from DEM, EPA, and Department of Health are all there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Sharon, and hopefully we're going to have you back, because it sounds like there's a whole bunch of things we can talk about to continue this conversation. See you next week.